It's a huge honor to have with us today Professor Nadia Oweidat, who's an assistant professor in the Department of History at Kansas State University. Her research focuses on the history, culture, and politics of the modern Middle East and North Africa, as well as the intellectual history of Islamic thought. She also works on themes related to Islamic militancy, the ideological evolution of groups such as Al-Qaeda, Salafi jihadi networks, jihadi strategies in Iraq, Iran's role in the Arab world, and the radicalization of Muslim youth. Her first book has been published last year, Reform and its Perils in Contemporary Islam, the Case of Nasr Hamed Abu Zayd, published by Oxford University Press. This is a book that concerns the efforts of Muslim intellectuals to reconcile their religious identities with liberal values in the contemporary world. And of course, it's against the backdrop of a very famous case that I have a vivid memory of that broke in the mid-1990s related to a famous Egyptian Islamic studies scholar. I won't say more about that case because I'm hoping that Nadia is going to talk about it in some detail. So it's great to have her here. I believe this is an updated and expanded version of her doctoral dissertation that she defended at Oxford. Nadia, thank you for being here. Please join me in welcoming Nadia Oweidat.
Very much, Nadia, for having me here. And I'm grateful to the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and to Georgetown University. I actually taught at Georgetown, and it's really great to be back here. So, and thank you all for taking the time to attend. So who is Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd? Why is he worthy of a book? So I'm a firm believer as an intellectual historian or historian of ideas, that ideas do matter. Ideas are the very first stage of how we live our lives, how we organize our lives. And when I say how we organize our lives, I mean every aspect of our lives, whether it's the personal, the political, the financial. It all starts with an idea of how do we organize ourselves? What is my right? What is, everybody else's right in comparison to mine? And, we here enjoy, certain rights and privileges because there were thinkers who gave a lot of time to come up with this liberal democratic norm that institutes that every single one of us have freedoms, have freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom to choose your government, freedom, all kinds of freedoms. It started with an idea that was debated and published and supported and enough people bought into this idea until it became a reality. So in the Arab world, and in the Muslim world, but mainly I'm going to focus on the Arab world because that's my area of strength. There are a lot of amazing thinkers, and they have been producing amazing ideas. So where are these ideas? Like, why aren't they, in the public eye enough so that they can be debated and discussed and people can get behind these ideas, right? So Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd is one of the foremost intellectuals in the reform movement. And there's different names that, for example, one scholar calls scholars like Abu Zayd cosmopolitans because they're very global, if you would, very in their adherence to global human rights, universal human rights. Others call them modernists because they really believe in modern values. A lot of the values we take for granted are very much modern. There has never been before in history an era like where that many individuals have that many rights, right? It is something new. It didn't exist centuries ago. So Abu Zayd belongs to this class of thinkers, and he actually contributed, in my opinion, which is why I picked him, he contributed in such unique ways. So he was influenced by a class of thinkers who've been thinking about how to incorporate modernity and Islam since the 19th century, right? When modernity was introduced globally, and a lot of thinkers, not just in the Middle East, like in Asia, in Africa, people were trying to, basically wed modern norms with, the past. And there was a break and a transition into something new. So before Abu Zayd, again, there's a line of intellectuals, which is why my very first chapter in my book is the intellectual history. What happens first? You have Muhammad Ali in Egypt. He sent scholars to basically translate, to get the best of French, because French was the predominant culture, to bring the military sciences of France into Egypt, so he can have military might. But he sent scholars like Tahtawi, who not only translated military manuals, but he also translated the Constitution, the French Constitution, which had very novel ideas, like the people pick the leader. People have all kinds of rights. That was a very foreign concept. And if you really want to get a glimpse of how foreign a lot of these ideas that we now take for granted, I highly recommend the book An Imam in Paris, because that book basically captures that moment when he sees modern concepts and how he, and this is somebody who was influenced by these modern concepts, went back to Egypt to advocate a very revolutionary modern idea, which is to put boys and girls together in schools and educate them equally, and all kind of ideas to allow women to be part of the public sphere versus in the harem, in the enclosed family quarters. So all kinds of modern ideas. So a lot of these scholars, again, they didn't just translate military manuals, they translated philosophy and ideas. And then we start to see these modern ideas come into the Arab world. And there started a class of intellectuals that started to think, wow, like these modern ideas, how do we apply them to Islam? Because they had such belief that their religion is so different than Christianity. Christianity maybe hindered the path of progress, but Islam is so open, that's such confidence that no, Islam can incorporate all these ideals and actually champion them, because it is, again, it's actually an act of faith, right? Like complete act of faith. So then we start to have this new trend. You have, for example, Amin al-Khawli, one scholar so we have modern ideas like men and women and all kinds of modern ideas that simply are not supported by the Quran. So how do you square this circle, if you would? So basically he said, well, we have to look at the Quran as a lot of these parables, they're not meant to be, literal. There's just an idea behind it, like justice, equality. Like you have to remove, the context, the historic moment, and see something, distill something that is universal, that honors, modern values, etc. So you start to have a lot of these thinkers, but from the get-go, you also start to have resistance to these thinkers. And, sadly enough, like as Abu Zayd himself would point out, like, for example, every single, like the majority, I should say, of the thinkers from medieval times who wanted to wed Greek philosophy with Islam were persecuted. Actually, you could pretty much generalize. And many of them were actually assassinated because, there were extremists who said, nope, there's only one version and might is right, and whoever had more force can dictate their way. So there's a history, sadly, of not enough space for these ideas to be debated and tested and, taken on with real critique, real exchange. That is something that Abu Zayd was very, very passionate about. So by the time Abu Zayd was born, there already has been, 200 years of thinkers thinking about modernity. And even when he was a child, he aspired to be like one of them. Muhammad Abdu is one of the big reformer names. And Abu Zayd's father, when he was alive, he actually aspired for his son to be like Muhammad Abdu. Mm-hmm. Somebody who is a pious, religious man, but who is very reform-oriented, who is not at war with modernity, but actually sees Islam as a big enough container to absorb modern values that didn't exist before. So, sadly for Abu Zayd, his father died, and he, as the oldest son, he had to take care of his family. So he had to study something really practical. He was a, the Arabic word, basically a technician. مهندس لاسلكي. A technician, yeah. And what happened is he never actually gave up on his dream. He memorized the Quran by the age of 8. He already had like an astute political, analytical, philosophical mind. He really has always had it. Like when you listen to him, and I encourage you all to go online, he has many beautiful long interviews in Arabic and English in which he talks about his childhood, and he really had it in him. You know, just noticing the different ideas and the way people deal with ideas. Like it's like he was a historian of ideas from inception, it feels like. So he never gave up on that dream and started a university degree as part-time. And eventually he became an academic, and he did so well that his university that granted him the doctorate, they basically said to him, please stay on and take this chair. Ironically, the chair that was offered to him, every single professor who held it, Taha Hussein, Amin al-Kholi, Muhammad Khalifallah, were the same kind of thinkers as he was. Somebody who wants to modernize, somebody who believes that the modern ideals that honor people, regardless of their background, their belief, etc., these ideals, universal ideals, are the real Islam. It doesn't matter what the text says, it doesn't matter what the historical precedents. The divine is so just, is so, you know, you just need to understand the text in a way to see these ideals. So Abu Zayd, so why was he, let me finish the story. So he became a professor. He wrote this book, very controversial book, Critique of Religious Thought. In this book, so Abu Zayd, being a very, very astute and successful academic, he got a lot of fellowships. He got a Ford fellowship. He studied at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a visiting professor at Osaka University in Japan. Mm-hmm. And being a very open-minded, curious person, everywhere he went, he truly, you know, delved into that culture. Like when he came to America, he's such a learner. Like Tahtawi, the man he really admires when he went to France. He was such a learner. He delved into all these sciences that people who modernized Christianity delved into, like hermeneutics, you know, all kinds of sciences that actually, you know, people use to upgrade, if you would, religious thought, so that it's, you know, because with evolution of humanity, new knowledge comes, you know, to light. And he wanted to basically do the same thing with Islam. Abu Zayd believed that Islam has not had a real updated knowledge since 800 AD, like, or 900 AD. Like there has been a closure of the gate of ijtihad since medieval times, and it hasn't really been open since. And humanity has evolved so much since then. There's been so many sciences that has evolved, you know, history, semantics, all kinds of ideas, which is why I actually picked my cover of my book as a gate, because it's about opening a gate, right? The gate of ideas. And so he wrote this book, and this book was controversial, but it didn't really become, it's a very academic book. It didn't become controversial until much later. You know, you can write a book and nobody notices it, and maybe 2 years later it becomes famous, and all of a sudden, like, you know, it gets the limelight, if you would. So what did he argue in this would be very, very controversial book? So when his book came out, first of all, even the ideas of the book came to him when he was in Japan. So Japan does not have a sacred text like the Quran, but it's very traditional and is very proud of its tradition. So he was inspired by how you can combine a traditional society with modern ideas and liberal democratic norms. At the time, there was a huge scandal in Egypt, where basically millions of Egyptians invested in what is called Islamic investment. were basically that promise, this is an Islamic investment, but because it's Islamic, of course, it's going to be massively profitable, unlike the un-Islamic, savings account or investment, because it's not Islamic. So he played to people's naivete, greed, belief that anything Islamic is superior. And what ensued is that millions of Egyptians lost their savings, their whole life savings. And he was outraged. He was outraged that the religion that people held so dearly should be used for profit of a few. So in order to pull off this scheme, there needed to be some religious scholars to say, yep, this is absolutely Islamic. And one of them was at his university. He was a professor, but he was also an Islamist with, a following outside the university. He gave, he was an imam at Amr bin al-As mosque in Egypt, in Cairo. And what happened is, in this book, Abu Zayd took on, this is how ambitious intellectually I would say Abu Zayd is. He looked at the whole, Islamist thinking. And I want you to keep in mind, as you think about this is a man who was very pious. This is a man who believed, he had deep faith. He wasn't a secularist, for example, the Syrian intellectual, Sadiq al-Adham. He wasn't like Sadiq al-Adham, an atheist. Abu Zayd was a believer. He's somebody who was pious. He's somebody who, but he took on Islamist thought because he believed that it is actually hindering the progress of Muslims. So he looked at it and he said, okay, there are 5 major problems with the way this paradigm of Islamist thinking is constructed. Number 1 challenge is that they merge the humanly produced thought with the religion itself. So there's, the divine, like the Quran, for example, what is Muhammad, the messenger of God. Okay, these are 2, if you would, divine sources. But there are books written, At-Tabari, Al-Bukhari. Some of them came hundreds of years after Muhammad. So to merge both, that you cannot critique. So basically, why can't I critique even Shafi'i? This is a human being who had his own ideas, and I have my own idea. So why is one thinker superior to another because they're older? If you think of physics, Newton had an idea about, physics. Then we have quantum physics now. Can we say, well, no, we have to stick to Newton. We cannot progress because now we know there's quantum. So for Abu Zayd, it's something like that. We have to evolve. The thinking that existed, it was limited to what was available then, but we have a lot more knowledge to incorporate, many more mechanisms that would give us a more accurate picture. So why should we limit ourselves to the understanding of a few people? And there's as you may know, there's a plethora of thinkers and intellectuals, but the books of a few are taken as this is it. Again, who decided? Why? So Abu Zayd wanted to break that connection, that merger between religious thought produced by thinkers, and Islam itself. So he wanted to widen that circle of who can produce thought. The other thing is Abu Zayd critiqued explaining all phenomena on earth by one cause, religion. He wanted there's an art, there's a science, every field should have its own mechanisms. If you limit everything to have to go through the prism of one religion, that he saw that as problematic. Because, for example, an imam, what does he know about genetic editing? What does he know about all kinds of scientific, artistic? So we cannot put as an arbiter a person with one qualifications and have him just expand his qualifications to all fields on earth. Like, no. But religious thought is one realm. Science, physics, all other fields have to have their own mechanism of basically evaluating that field and studying. So again, like, if you think about it, his end goal is to actually empower Muslim thought, right? To have an expansion of ideas. The third that Abu Zayd protested and saw as weakness in Islamists, and when I say Islamist, I assume I'm in front of a very educated audiences, but Islam is different than Islamist. Islamist is somebody, essentially, those who want to impose a version, there's many versions, there's many interpretations, political versions on everybody. So that they want their political version to be imposed on everybody, versus Muslims, for example, who come in every shape and form. So the third weakness he saw, or that he protested in Islamic discourse, is revering the authority of the heritage and Turath, the old, basically. Anything that is old is automatically better. And he challenged that notion. He said, in this paradigm, basically the father is always right and the son is never right, because the father is old. Like, it's just an age thing. But again, if you look at any other science, it's not always old means better, and it's not always old means worse either. But he wanted to separate these two. He wanted, again, critical thinking, academic rigor to go into every idea. The fourth mechanism that Abu Zayd critiqued is, intellectual certainty. Basically, what that means is, like, he critiqued that notion that if you don't agree with me, I own the truth. So if you don't agree with me, that's it. You're excommunicated. Takfir, excommunicating of fellow Muslims, is a problem that he spoke about at length, because for him, it's a very bankrupt way of stopping the debate instead of having an exchange of ideas. When instead of, when a scholar poses an idea, instead of taking that idea and looking at its weaknesses, its strength, immediately just excommunicating that person, he saw that as very, very problematic. Because Abu Zayd believed nobody owns the truth. And finally, the weakness that he saw in Islamist thinking, or what he calls al-khitab ad-dini, religious discourse, is not taken into consideration the historic context. Again, like, you cannot take 7th century Arabia and say this is how we live, because even if we take 7th century Arabia is not 7th century Levant, is not 7th century Egypt, and they're right next to each other. So you cannot, you have to take into consideration the historic context of everything about this, heritage, because Abu Zayd discerned that, if you look at the Muslim world, a lot of the Muslim world has had already thousands of history before Islam came. He gave the analogy of a huge tree, and Islam is the last bark on the tree, if you would. But there's been already thousands of years of history. So he wanted that historic context to be taken into consideration, because again, if you look at Islam, and now we have, at the time Abu Zayd passed away in 2010, we have massively diverse populations, and Islam in Indonesia is not the same as Islam in China, Islam in the Middle East, so he really wanted the historic context of every idea, every issue that is raised to really be taken into consideration. And he critiqued people who use Islam to intimidate people, rip them of the right to have democratic, liberal norms. He critiqued those who want to impose a certain Islamist government, and those who use their Islamic credentials to ends like robbing people off of their life savings. So when Abu Zayd, when he was up for promotion to be an associate professor, one of the people on his committee was a guy he critiques for being part of that Ponzi scheme of Islamic investment. So he had an axe to grind. So not only did he recommend that he not get the promotion, he went to his mosque and told a whole bunch of people, as you know, most people will get, stabbed or killed by a fanatic. That fanatic never read their books. Like they have no idea what their ideas are. Most recently, the guy who stabbed Salman Rushdie for the latest time, like he's never read him. He has no idea how to engage with his ideas. Yeah. So basically, Abdus Sabur Shaheen, that professor, who would later himself become an object of excommunication for another theory he has, ironically. So he told people in a mosque that basically Abu Zayd is an apostate. He cannot be considered a Muslim. And of course, people took him as an authority because, again, they don't know much about Abu Zayd. So then Abu Zayd, basically, some of the people who were present, they took him to court. And after a lengthy process, basically the courts sided with his adversaries. Because it was a time, if you think of Egypt in the 90s, there was a lot of terrorist attacks. Islamism was flowering like crazy. It's a different Egypt, for example, than the first half of the 20th century, where there's a lot of liberal ideas. Like, seriously, if you read the ideas and the books of authors, especially closer, to the 1920s, even 1900s, 18 something, you'll be shocked. Like in today's world, they'll be seeing, wow, this is so liberal. They were so incredibly progressive compared to what we have now. But Egypt in the 90s was not that kind of liberal, space. It was full of Islamists, and they have come even to universities, and they've become part of institutions. And so maybe not surprisingly, Abu Zayd was deemed an apostate. And as you know, if you are deemed an apostate, any nutcase can just decide, oh, I'm going to kill an apostate, and that's good, because killing apostates is great in the popular culture. So this is how Abu Zayd got to emigrate to the Netherlands. The Netherlands offered him freedom of thought and expression and research that was not available in Egypt. And he would thrive. And in the Netherlands, he was able to broaden his horizon because he's no longer just dealing with, Egyptian students or Sudanese students or like Arabic speaking students. All of a sudden, he's also mentoring and speaking with and exchanging ideas with, in addition to all the Western scholars and students, but also Muslim scholars from around the Muslim world. And he realized how Arab-centric Islamic thought in the Arab world is, how actually other cultures, other languages, other, communities have came up with completely different answers to the same questions than the Arab world, because they have different perspective, different histories, like the Persian, the Indonesian, different Muslims, right, who were studying in Europe. So he really got to enjoy and speaks incredibly fondly of his students from around the Muslim world, and realize like, wow, the Arab world is a minority in Islam, and all these cultures contributed massively, and people in the Arab world don't realize that how important that contribution is. He was particularly impressed and engaged with Persian literature and Persian scholars, as well as Indonesians. And actually, in both countries, in Iran as well as in Indonesia, he has a large following because his books were translated into these languages and scholars engaged with them. So Abu Zayd died suddenly from a virus while he was visiting Indonesia. He was working on another interpretation of the Quran. And it's such a loss to all of us that it didn't get to be published. And but he's a very prolific writer. And because he, went abroad, he started to also write in English. Yale University Press translated this book into English. So one of his books is translated into English, which is great. My book is the first book about him in English. However, I am certain it won't be the last. Why wouldn't it be the last? Because that space, that debate, that idea of where does religion fit in modern life is still an important debate. We still need, people like Abu Zayd have, you know how hard it is, you're at an academic institution, how hard it is to think about something, right? And Abu Zayd dedicated his entire life to thinking about a way of life where people can be Muslim, but a way of life that does not infringe, does not lead to the persecution of any minority, including, he's such a liberal thinker, including within Islam. Again, if you listen to his YouTube interviews, he says things like, it cannot be the case that a human being is free to believe whatever they want until they become Muslim, but they cannot leave Islam. Then we will kill you. It's a one-way street. You can come in, once you come in, we kill you if you change your mind. He said, that cannot be the case. And if you read, maybe some of you read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. So his thought about even how, just like on liberty, like the community cannot force individuals with the pressure of numbers to crush the will of the individual if it's different. Like the society has to respect. This is a very, very liberal idea, very new idea, modern idea. That the individual has to be respected no matter what the will of the society is. You cannot pressure, you cannot. And Abu Zayd had that same idea about Islam, that even the community, like if a Muslim man or woman wants to leave Islam, the community cannot persecute them. They have to leave them, like they have to give them freedom. And this is what he believed. He believed Islam, if you interpret it enough, like correctly, you will end up with liberal democratic norms. So what is my critique of him? So I get that this man truly believes, and I underscore believe, that truly the only, he would say that, the only correct interpretation is one that honors the innate universal human rights of every single individual on earth, no matter who they are. And he would stress that we don't know, like in the Quran, there's reference to other religions and we don't know if maybe Buddhism is one of them, and this is the way to get to God in, Tibet, whatever, that we don't know about. We're Muslims, we cannot know. We simply cannot know the will of God. And the word of God with a W is beyond our human, we cannot decide who God is. Like God is bigger than us. And if the word of God is already mentioned in the Quran that there's that God spoke to then we have to contemplate the possibility that God spoke to humanity in other languages and other religions, not just Islam. You can see how this is a very revolutionary idea, right? And it's a very modern idea in some ways. It's a very, again, liberal idea. So in my book, and again, Abu Zayd, because he's such a prolific writer, and he wrote about, contemporary Islamic thought. He wrote about the Mu'tazila, again, medieval strand of thought that combined Hellenistic thought with Sharia. He wrote about Sufism, which is completely different beast, right? Like very, almost like, has some ideas that can be compared to or close to Buddhism, and the closeness of Persia to India. You can see that, again, the historic context. But Sufism is his personal brand of Islam, actually. So he wrote about a lot of different things, but in all of it, he was a product of modern, liberal, democratic, universal human rights. Like that is the prism through which he saw the divine can exist. So he didn't believe that authoritarianism could possibly be Islamic, but there's no way. He didn't believe that abuse of women's rights can be Islamic. Like that was, he wrote a whole book to actually argue for women's rights. So how do you justify it? And how do you, there are verses in the Quran, there's a historic precedent. There's a lot of things from history. We cannot say, oh, they didn't exist. We cannot wipe out episodes of history that are just do not apply to modern liberal, if you take sexual slavery, sabi, right? There's slavery and there's sexual slavery. Women and children were put in the market up until the last century. That's something that was practiced continuously in the Muslim world. There was never a movement to say, you cannot enslave girls. And you can have an unlimited number of them, by the way. You can have 4 wives and unlimited number of sabaya. So how do you square that with human rights and women's rights? Like there's no way you can say being raped and sold, and that's actually, if you look at it correctly, it really is very honoring to women. So me as a scholar, as a critical thinker, maybe I don't share Abu Zayd's phenomenally deep faith that, yes, this is what really is meant by the text. You just have to, I wasn't convinced, honestly, by his argument. I appreciate it. I admire it. I see that he really has, the end product is a world where each of us can be whoever they want to be and believe whatever they want to be, and they're protected and they're honored, and there's no imposition of any one idea. But I did not think his argument is always sound to me. I thought it was, a lot of times it really relied more on faith than actual, it makes sense. There's logic. Because again, like God, for example, said, avoid alcohol, right? Al-khamr, yeah? Ijtanibu al-khamr. Avoid, he could have said, no slavery. He's good. He could do whatever he wants. Like, why not just, They said, oh, no, God really needed to speak to the people. Like, well, why didn't God do the same with wine? People drank wine. It was something they do. Like, there was that reasoning that he wanted to bring to other things. Like, we need to be able to critique. We need to be able to discuss and debate and critique without fear to get to the truth. His own methodology, I didn't think that it was always, that it always withstood the test. But he came up with something absolutely brilliant, which is why I think there should be a lot more studies and books about him. So one way you can address that disparity between the text and history on the one hand and modern liberal Islamic, modern liberal Islamic, not Islamic, modern liberal values, is to say, again, like the word of God. Muhammad was the recipient of the word of God. Muhammad is a human being. Muhammad was a product of 7th century Arabia. He had his own ideas, his own, like maybe between the, al-mursal wal-mukhatab, between the, when the revelation was revealed and it was received, like maybe there was some misunderstanding. Or there's also the issue of all these wars that immediately happened after the death of Muhammad. There's multiple versions of the Quran, as we know. There's, Uthman burned all the different, versions. So there's all kinds of ways, all kinds of historic ways or methodologies you can undermine the texts, and only the texts that are problematic. Now, again, there's two parts to this. One is if you're a believer, like belief is a powerful force. Something does not have to be factual to be truthful, to be powerful. Like fact and powerful don't have to contradict each other. Like when I think even of, you know, for example, me as a scholar, somebody who's really delved into all the old texts and versus I have a brother who's religious, the sweetest. I don't think he's ever read a book on Islamic history or that, I'm pretty certain. For him, Islam does not allow the death of any human being. That's his belief. You cannot give him argument. Like I wouldn't even try. I wouldn't even start because that's his belief. Like let him believe whatever he wants. Like he's not a scholar. He's not an intellectual. I am somebody who's like a scientist, a nerd. I want to get to the idea. I want to see all the resources. I want to like examine this, discuss it with my students. We all talk together, and so there's that side, and there's the belief. And what Abu Zayd, again, the end product of his belief is something you cannot say, you cannot fault. It's an end product that doesn't, you know, rip away the rights of anybody, except those who want the right to eliminate all other different ideas. So even though I didn't buy his argument all the way, I am I deeply admire his thought and his contribution and pushing us closer to do more investigation. Who knows? Like, let us open the gate of ijtihad, as you would say. Let us open the gate of academic rigor and let's see what happens. Like he was not afraid to look, to examine, and he wanted his fellow Muslims to have the same courage. And I'll end here and I'll let you ask questions.
Great. Thank you very much. First of all, let me begin by thanking you for focusing on the work of Nasr Hamed Abu Zayd. He is a unique thinker.
He is.
And had you not sort of, I think, given your time and energy to studying his work and publish this book, in many ways, he could have been forgotten. So you've kept him alive in ways that I think
Thank you.
just by themselves, you know, deserves a huge round of applause and appreciation. Could you, before I have a lot of questions, but could you begin just by telling the audience, because I don't know if everyone is as familiar with his case as I am. You talked about it, but one of the things that you didn't talk about is that at the beginning of the controversy, when he goes up for tenure, and then one of the people that he critiques in one of his works then goes to court and launches a court case against him. What was the charge?
That he is not a Muslim. He wanted Abu Zayd to be declared an apostate.
Yeah.
And as an apostate, he's not allowed to marry a Muslim woman. So his marriage would be annulled.
Yeah.
He would not be allowed to inherit as an apostate. I mean, again, this is not very liberal democratic ideals, right? Like, but this is Sharia law. This goes against what Abu Zayd wanted to create.
Yeah.
But those who actually waged the lawsuit against him, they provided evidence, quote unquote, to his apostasy.
Yeah.
One of them is that this person, Abu Zayd, focuses on fringe ideologies, i.e., Mu'tazila, the rationalist brand of Islam, and Sufism. Both of them, imagine like how this gives you an idea of the atmosphere, that this was given as evidence that Abu Zayd is not a Muslim because he is focusing on Mu'tazila and Sufism versus orthodoxy. They read out loud entire, I quote them in my book, entire paragraphs to basically, you know, again, Abu Zayd was a scholar. He has, you know, a PhD in linguistics and Islamic studies. But for the lay person, you say something like, who is the speaker in the Quran versus the receiver? And it's like, why are you even talking about the Quran as a text, as a linguistic text? That's very offensive to a lot of people. Like, no, it's sacred, it's holy. Don't touch it. It's like, so, but he's a scholar. He's like a scientist. He's, so the people who filed this lawsuit against him, they sort of took advantage of the lack of basically ignorance among a lot of people, and holding against him his scholarship, holding against him the ways in which his knowledge way surpasses the lay person, the average person.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened, for example, with Taha Hussein, one of the people
Mhm.
who held the same chair, is
Mhm.
that, so Taha Hussein, you know, he examined some of the so-called Jahili poetry that is supposed to be pre-Islamic, but he's like, well, but actually there's no way this is pre-Islamic because a lot of the references are post-Islamic. But that notion, I mean, it should be very easy to just say, okay, let's examine this. But the first reaction is takfir. No, don't touch this. Like, let's not examine anything. Let's not even look into it. Like, we cannot think critically or courageously or even be curious to know the truth. Anything that shakes a little bit what we think is truth, that's immediately silencing. So Taha Hussein argued that some of the poetry is post-Islam. So why is that problematic? Because it talks about conquest and wine and all kinds of courts that, you know, that have a lot of, you know, dancing and singing and you know, it's debaucheries, and this does not like go with the popular culture. Once there was Islam, everybody became pious. Nobody made a mistake. Everybody became like robotically, you know, the same way in their piety and never sinned again. Like that is almost the you know, if you watch, if you grew up like me watching Ramadan series, like all these companions are just perfect and everything is just everything. And it doesn't square with the history of wars immediately after the death of Muhammad and with the Prophet's closest companions killing each other.
Yeah.
It doesn't square.
Yeah.
But again, the image versus the truth, there's a tension.
So you can, I mean, I guess I was shocked. You can go to in an Egyptian court, at least back then, someone could go and file a case against you to prove that you're an apostate.
Correct.
And so what about the role of the Egyptian state? Did the Egyptian state intervene to protect the rights of this citizen, or what?
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
great question.
Yeah.
Great question. So again, you know, I mentioned a little bit the tension between the modern values and traditional values, right? So a lot of these societies that adopted a lot of modern norms, like the nation state, like citizenship, these modern legal norms, they don't always sit comfortably in society. So in medieval times, there was a concept called hisba, where basically it was considered against, you know how we have public interest, if you would. It was considered against the public interest. Anybody can say, what's your name, sir? Rami? I'm going to pick on you, Rami. Rami is disturbing the public interest. And to preserve that public interest, I mean, there can even be something like this now, but what is considered disturbance of public interest? And in the Hisba, for somebody, I mean, when you think about, this is my own ijtihad, if you would, my own scholarship. If you think about the expansion of Islam, Islam came from Arabia, it expanded into places that are way more like the Persian Empire or even the Levant or Egypt, way more advanced by almost light years, right? And there was insecurity. Like, okay, so these conquerors had might, but they didn't have the cultural depth, the phenomenal civilization that has lasted for thousands of years before Islam came, that Arabia hadn't had a rival to. So they needed to put in place things like non-Muslims cannot proselytize to Muslims, but Muslims can proselytize to non-Muslims. It's a one-way street. You can, you know, preach Islam, but those who live there can never say anything about, you know, their religion, for example. They cannot proselytize. So all these from bygone era, there were still remnants of them in the modern time. So if somebody is preaching something that is perceived as anti-Islamic, that was in the medieval ages, so that Islam can have that prestige and nobody can critique it, or people can't just move out of Islam because, you know, for example, there's a lot of story. If you read Tarikh al-Tabari, which is the oldest history in Arabic, 11 volumes, I should warn you. I mean, you really see documented in a lot of, like, if you take the oldest 100 volumes, a lot of them in Arabic, but because even the Persians, you know, they put as you know, the the grammar of Arabic. They basically invented the grammar of Arabic. And if you take them, there's a story yet to be told, I think. I really think we're yet to truly, because of that fear, the excommunication, it has never stopped, really, as I said. There's never been a real examination of that Islam. We see it now as a dominant religion. It's very confident. It's very by the time of Tahtawi, but it wasn't always that way. And there needed to be, laws to ensure that Muslims don't just convert to Christianity, as many were tempted, right? And they were impressed by the churches, which made Muslims, build mosques that are so impressive to compete with the churches versus how they had it in Arabia, very simple, like all kinds of ways. You see the development of hadith, where the Muhammad's, there's a competition to create an image of Muhammad like Jesus. Like there's all kinds of histories and stories that yet to be told. So Hisbah, from that time where, and it basically you can basically hold somebody accountable for questioning
disturbing the public peace.
Yes, right. by and so that medieval law
still exists.
Yep, still exists.
And so the Egyptian state, talk about connected to the Egyptian state at the time.
So in all the Arabic countries, a lot of them state, and this only was I don't know if they change it now, but Tunisia was the first exception in history where they say Sharia is the source of the law. Right. So there's modern law and Sharia law. And again, they don't always sit perfectly. They, like you see family law is based on Sharia, where when I grew up in Jordan, I didn't have agency. My agency belonged to my guardian, my father. So I couldn't, even when I left Jordan, and that's in 1999, I couldn't go say, can I get a passport? They're like, where's your guardian? Like, get out of the way. Who owns you? Yeah. That's the Sharia law. Yeah. So custody, it's still based on Sharia law. Like, so the old and the new, they still, and we don't have, sadly, we don't have liberal democratic norms and people examining laws, and we still have long ways to modernize.
So this gets to my next question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. What you didn't, I haven't read your book yet, so maybe you talk about this in your book, but in your presentation, you didn't speak to what I think is absolutely foundational to assessing ideas, and that's the political, economic, moral, and international context of each ideas. So the ideas that, the context that Abu Zayd was living in my reading, was a context that was very disadvantageous to someone like him who wanted to sort of challenge accepted norms on religion. So what is that context? Egypt is, in the 1990s, when the scandal erupted, is a post-colonial society.
Yes.
It's a society that was deeply shaped by the legacy of European imperialism, colonialism, the struggle for decolonization, the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and then the steady and persistent shift toward authoritarianism.
Absolutely.
And so he's writing in the context of Hosni Mubarak's authoritarian state that has a peace treaty with Israel, which is viewed by people in the region as a colonial settler state, backed by billions of dollars of American aid that flow every year. And a suffocating context with a lot of political prisoners. Now it's much worse, but back then that was the state of affairs. And you have a lot of course, in my reading, a lot of poor people.
Absolutely.
I remember back in the 1990s, the statistic was that, half of the Egyptian population was living on $2 a day. A lot of poverty. And so, and then you have a weak state, right? A weak state that is scared of its own society. And it's trying to stay in power by obviously sort of figuring out how it can sort of find out where the threats are and sort of deal with those threats in ways that would allow the regime to survive and perpetuate itself. And sometimes a regime survival strategy includes throwing someone like Abu Zayd under the bus. Because if you don't throw him under the bus, when there's a societal upsurge of anger, that anger could then be directed at the state.
Absolutely.
And the state, wants to survive. So if it means, so when you put that all together, what does it mean? It means that, one of the, I think I would say, guilty parties or complicating factors to this tragic story of Abu Zayd is this enveloping context of authoritarianism, which is both a problem of the Egyptian military, but it's also a problem of external factors that are backing the Egyptian military and precisely do not allow for the creation of a free, open, legally secure society where people can have the type of debates and exchanges and then have the law protect them in case something goes wrong. So, we're dealing with a society that I would argue is still at that time, is in the early phases of modernization, is still a very traditional society, and is a society that I think in many ways is facing a lot of internal fault lines.
Absolutely.
And so in that context of what I would call mass pauperization, religion becomes, for many poor people, a source of security for them. And so when someone is perceived to be coming and attacking their sacred understanding of Islam, even though he himself might be a pious and practicing Muslim and just has a different way of interpreting the text, this is a perfect recipe for a storm.
Absolutely. So
can you comment on that?
Absolutely. So context is absolutely vital. And Abu Zayd does bring it up every step of the way. And I bring it up, of course, in my book.
Yeah.
And he, again, unemployment of youth, he discusses that, how the political, like you said, Abu Zayd speaks at length on how the political uses the religious to manipulate people. He is such a bleeding heart for the poor Egyptian man, the poor Egyptian woman.
Yeah.
So he really, in fact, in one interview, he was asked, like, are you outraged? Do you need your pride to be vindicated? And he said, every single Egyptian, I am just one Egyptian. All of us are suffering under authoritarianism.
Yeah.
I am just one of many. Why should I be above all these?
Did he explicitly criticize Mubarak and his policies?
He criticized authoritarianism.
Yeah, but not explicitly the state, because that would obviously be a bridge too far in many ways. He could get arrested.
He does
but he
not
criticized authoritarianism.
He does.
Yeah.
In fact, I myself, I feel very strongly about authoritarianism. My second book is on authoritarianism.
Right.
It's on digital authoritarianism. But as for him, authoritarianism was political and religious. For my next book, it's digital now.
Yeah.
It's being watched, it's being censored, our context really matters. That's a great point to raise, is that context matters. He's a product of his own time and space. And in all authoritarianism is at the bedrock of what he critiques, and absolutely including colonial authoritarianism, so he absolutely addresses that. He is very critical of toxic capitalism that is very cares about nothing except the bottom line versus people. He is very compassionate to human beings.
I have a lot more questions, but this audience has been sitting patiently, and they have, you go ahead. You're first.
I'd like to ask about the context. So in the past 20 years, has the Arab world become more receptive or more hostile to such ideas?
So I like to believe that it's more receptive. The reason why I say that is because sometimes it takes a while for ideas to really like a seed to become a blooming tree, right? And I actually sit on, this is, I love to share this. I sit on the board of a free online library called, Hindawi.org. They have thousands of Arabic books for free, because it was really hard, as the Arab world does not have enough access to libraries, as documented by the UN Arab Human Development Report. So there was a knowledge deficit, and the Hindawis, it's a foundation, wanted to address that knowledge deficit. So they created this online library. So Abu Zayd's books were banned in most of the Arab world. When I was a graduate student, I'd go bookstore to bookstore to get his books, to get this book, and I would sometimes go into a bookstore they're hiding it, and so now his books are free online. Anybody can access them, so people can actually also forward them as PDFs, so we can discuss his ideas. And again, the reason why I haven't given up on his ideas staying relevant is because we still have the same challenge. We are a very spiritual community. Like religion, like you
Mhm.
said, is a blanket.
Yeah.
It is a sacred blanket. It's a safety.
Mhm.
So how do we have liberal democratic norms, which everybody wants? People are voting with their feet, and nobody is risking their lives to go to an authoritarian state. They want liberal democratic norms. So how do you have your religion, but also have this freedom,
Mhm.
academic freedom, political freedom, challenging authoritarianism? So it's still relevant. And I think, again, we need a little bit more freedom. And sadly, right now, there's still a lot of oppression, a lot of, including with the political atmosphere.
I would argue it's much worse post-Arab
Yes,
Spring.
actually, I
right?
agree.
I mean, just in Egypt,
Absolutely, no
Egypt
question.
itself, El-Sisi is a much bigger
No question.
tyrant, and I'm happy
No
to use that
question.
word tyrant than Mubarak ever was, right?
Actually, I do
Much
agree with
worse.
you. I agree with you.
Just-
It
yeah.
is so much worse because
But then the
because
question
we
then
are
becomes,
monitored 24/7.
Yeah,
Like
the question is-
dissent can take
yeah,
place.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
you see, for example,
Yeah.
Israel helping
Yeah.
the Gulf states
Yeah.
have spyware, so we
Yeah.
never have democracy.
So
Like,
then the question then becomes, if it's a much more repressive atmosphere now than it was in the 1990s, when
yeah,
Abu Zayd was writing, what does this mean for the whole question of liberal Islam, reinterpretation, opportunities to do what Abu Zayd, was trying to do? I mean, it would seem that the answer would be it's a much more toxic and difficult environment for an individual like him to come up and say something like this, because the social conditions of repression and poverty
Yes.
and anger are much
Yes.
greater now
absolutely,
than
no
they were in the
question.
1990s,
No
right?
question. I mean, the only thing is that authoritarianism, like people just explode eventually.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think, I'm a historian, look at history, look at the
Yeah.
French Revolution, right? You have an elite that monopolized all the
Yeah.
power, all the wealth. What happened to them? Most of
Yeah.
them lost their heads. Like, look at all the authoritarians in the region. I mean,
Yeah.
you can suppress people up to an extent until people feel. And this is what happened with Mubarak, but sadly now the bar is even higher.
Yeah.
People stop caring what happened to them, because if you rebel against
Yeah.
Mubarak or anything,
Yeah.
it's you, your family, like it's really.
finished. Yeah.
So for people
Yeah.
to get so desperate that they,
Yeah.
the Assad regime just felt like
Yeah.
eventually, like there is no real stability with oppression.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It just
Yeah.
cannot happen because people are deprived of
Yeah.
livelihood, of
Yeah.
basic needs.
And I would just, my last point before I take the next question, given that the current suffocating, in I would say tyrannical context, people are not interested in liberalism in the context of a authoritarian state.
Absolutely.
People are angry, they want revenge, they want certainty, they want safety, and it's usually that context where people want much more conservative, illiberal ideas, because it's those ideas that tend to give people the sense of safety and security. When someone comes along like Abu Zayd and says, well, we have to distinguish between the prophet himself and what, the revelation was coming to him, and we have to be more nuanced and more sort of retrospective. That's something to the average Muslim mind is very shocking. It doesn't produce a liberal I mean, the point I guess that I'm trying to make is this: if you look at the evolution of liberal ideas in the West, the evolution of liberal ideas in the West is coterminous with the expansion of democracy.
Yeah.
The institutional safeguards that
Yeah.
guarantee democracy,
Yeah.
the economic underpinnings
Absolutely.
where people aren't starving, right?
Yeah.
They have at least the basic necessities. Those are sort of the ingredients that are needed to advance a liberal project. You can't advance a liberal project in a national security state where people emerge from that experience,
Yeah.
angry, resentful, and wanting sort of to tear down the old regime.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's, I think, in my view, the big sort of context question that I think one has to think about.
I think there are two things here. One is semantics, which is important. The thing is, there has been an quote unquote secularism, liberalism for now decades and decades. So people don't understand what it is. They want to have their rights. They want to have their freedoms. They want to be free of authoritarianism. But if you say liberalism, they associate that with something foreign. So they want all the fruits of liberal democratic, and I'm talking about the classic liberal democratic norms, but they want the fruits of it, but the word itself doesn't sit well, and it has, its Western origin is very problematic.
So how do you do? What's the way forward because the term liberalism and secularism are
Yes.
viewed by most believing Muslims as sort of synonymous with immorality, right?
Yes,
Lack of
absolutely.
ethics.
Yep.
So how do you advance? I mean, this is, I think
Yeah.
what Nasr Hamed Abu Zayd was doing was actually advancing a liberal project from within the parameters of Islam.
Absolutely, no question.
So do you have any prescriptions on how you sort of advance a liberal agenda in the Muslim world, given that the term liberalism and
Correct.
atheism, and even now, unfortunately, human rights are viewed with suspicion?
Absolutely, because again, like I did a gig at the State Department and I worked on disinformation and misinformation. And we now know, like, and I also teach in my classes, Russian disinformation in the Arab world, they've been at it from before the Arab Spring. There's a brilliant book by a fellow academic at George Mason University dedicated to Arabic disinformation targeting the Arab world by the Russian state. What is that disinformation? Human rights is a Western concept. Liberal democratic norms, Western concept. So what do you want? Dictatorships? One person has all the power and the rest of us are slaves to that one person. So we need a new generation to actually, like, again, push for these rights as innate human rights. They're up against something massive. Again, Russian disinformation, Chinese disinformation is not a new thing also. And it's really sad when you have an elite saying, well, maybe we should do the China model. Well, have you looked at how the Uyghurs are treated by China? They're not allowed to talk to each other. There are cameras. Somebody looked and whispered something. They are dying of medical problems because they can't move. Like the oppression is so
They're in prison
astounding.
for reading the Quran, if you know the story of the Uyghurs.
They are so oppressed.
So
Is that the model you want? So we definitely need to have, and in my opinion, we need a global vision that takes on authoritarianism. And we need new thinkers, fresh thinkers.
much more difficult to do when we have an authoritarian man living in a White House not too far from here, right? But no, Rami, you were up next, and then Jonathan, and then we'll go to the back. Go ahead.
Well, Dr. Nadia, thank you very much for sharing.
You're welcome.
thoughts. Yeah, I'll definitely find the time and means to buy your book and get to know you better.
Thank you.
The memes are on the chairs.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, but the thing that I'm a linguist by nature, I speak 7 languages, and then I'm learning the 8th one, which is Arabic. Arabic is not my native. Although I may sounded gave you some keywords like muhandis. No, but this is the language I've been learning for the 6 years now for the Quran. So I'm trying to understand the Quranic text by learning Arabic. But it's not my native, absolutely. And I find it very interesting, right? I'm looking into the Quranic text through the linguistic approach.
Yes.
Okay. So my question to you, Dr. Nadia, as you're a native speaker, right? You're the native speaker of the Arabic. I know that by the book of the Salman Rushdie, citing on some verses, calling them satanic verses.
Correct.
That made pagan Meccans of that time went to the prostration together with the prophet, as they were amazed by he describes it in his way, but they literally went to prostration. Some would say that they were amazed by the poetry of the Quran or by the meaning of the verses. That was their problem, or that was their fact. But my question to you, provided that, well, the reason I'm asking is because you touched the Quran, the area of not my expertise, but my interest. So given that there is over 6,000 verses in the Quran, is there any just one verse that you would say, yes, this might be coming from, as you said, from the sender to the recipient? Or let me paraphrase, is there any verse that you would describe it as of divine origin? Just one, just one of those 6,000.
I mean, the Quran, like you said, is a huge document. And I went to Quranic memorization school. So I used to memorize big chunks of it. I don't recall all the verses, but I recall quite a bit. There are verses, there are verses that are really beautiful, that are really poetic, like good deeds, like a tree that has like, I mean, there's some pieces that are really, and there are parts, like there are verses that have foreign words, like Persian words, like Fardus is a Persian word. Like, so did Muhammad get that from, I mean, again, we need many more scholars to truly, and not be afraid of what they will find. Like let the search for truth be the search for truth be the motivating factor, and not, there are verses that, kill, behead, behead people, or اقطعوا أيديهم وأرجلهم عن خلاف, like cut opposite hands and feet. I mean, that's, not something I go, whoa, I mean, how holy, like,
No,
like,
I'd like to, Dr. Nadia,
so, yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to hear about just one verse that really would amaze you, and you would say, you will speak highly of this verse.
Yeah.
I've heard
Is
it.
there-
For
is there-
example,
just
like-
to get clear. Yeah, okay.
God is oneness. So, okay, I mean, that is, that's a Buddhist concept,
Yeah.
that is,
Yeah.
and what does that mean? If, like, there are many interpretations, but there's a lot of things that, again, like
Yeah.
need,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
I mean, the one that I would say that's obvious, especially at a center like this, is La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion.
Or Rabb al-Alameen,
Yeah.
like God is God of all people,
Yeah.
not just Rabb
So I mean, there's no
al-Alameen.
shortage of that. But
Yes,
anyways, we have to go
I
to the
agree.
next question, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask your take. We've spoken a lot about the development of ideas, intellectual history, and kind of looming in the background is this concept of power and political power, and how that affects the evolution, and which ideas are studied, honored, selected, which ideas are marginalized and tried to shove away to never see the light of day again.
Mhm.
And you also mentioned Abu Zayd going to Japan and seeing that kind of interface between modernity and tradition. And what it brings to my mind, once again, is the role of the US. And the role of the US in Japan is a very benign role that actually advances like liberal concepts and ideologies, because it sees it as a bulwark against China. But then you look at the Middle East and you see that the role of the US is 100% different. And it's about protection of Israel, it's about oil supply. And just to take a popular example, the dub for Frozen and the subtitles for Frozen, all of those dubs and subs, I grew up in Egypt, by the way, they used to be done in Egypt, of all of those films. But the dub and the sub, the dubbing and the subtitles for Frozen was done in Saudi Arabia. Because there's been this kind of, it's motivated, of course, by money, of like an attraction of the US to Saudi Arabia, and an uncritical and really support of the Saudi Arabian interpretation of Islam. And that has its ripple effects throughout the region. And so what my question is, or what I'm asking, is just for you to reflect on the role of the US, which is so often kind of conflated as this advancer of human rights or liberalism or democracy. Meanwhile, we stripped the green card of Mahmoud Khalil because he has the audacity to stand up for Palestinian rights.
Great question.
What in your view are the legacies and implications of the US influence on the evolution or the selection of what ideas are valid or not within the Islamic context in the Middle East?
Yeah, so if I may, I'm gonna look at Abu Zayd and how he treated this. Abu Zayd was a huge proponent that universal human rights are universal. In fact, one of the critiques I have of him in my book is that he divorces these ideas from their origins. It's like he does not want to acknowledge that these ideas were created not by Muslims, not by Japanese, not by, they were created by Western civilization. So he creates such a wall because he believes they're only universal. But the thing is, again, if we think that all ideas come as a result of a history and a context, like, why are you divorcing these ideals from their history? Because he finds them very attractive. And in my opinion, he also wants to make an argument for these ideas. But at the same time, he was very, very critical of colonialism, of the US role in the region. He was very critical. He has biting critique. A lot of it is online, like in his videos. I've watched both the Arabic and the English, so I don't remember where, but I am certain that he also discusses that his critique of Western impact, very negative Western impact on the Middle East. But at the same time, he is a great champion of liberal democratic norms.
So one last question, someone who hasn't asked a question before, and if there's no hands, then it can go to you. Go ahead.
Now, the US supported Islamic maybe fundamentalism in opposition to the Soviet Union and communism.
Yeah.
In Afghanistan, yeah.
Now that is gone. Will the US promote democracy, liberalism?
I wish. I'm a huge believer in soft power. Whatever idea you support, you are going to have a return on your investment. When the Arab Gulf states supported and invested in Wahhabism, you have global terrorism. You have terrorist attacks all over the world. I went to some Islamic schools, so I know the ideology very well. And I did counterterrorism research. And so when you invest in an idea, no matter how bankrupt, no matter how absurd this idea is, you put enough money behind it, you'll be amazed what happens. So I truly wish we would put our full weight behind liberal democratic norms, because there will be results, there will be consequences. And we have not invested as much as I believe we should in soft power, in these ideas. And they are not ideals that just people, believe in. Like, I think we had that erroneous, the US had that erroneous idea that we just need to remove the dictator, like in Iraq. And people will return to liberal democratic norms. Like, these are foreign norms. You need to teach them. That it's like saying, hey, these ideas, we go to school, we are an educational institution. It matters what you teach. People don't just automatically have these ideas at birth. They have to be taught, and people have to be engaged with them. So yeah, I really wish we would invest in soft power. That, in my opinion, that is a huge investment that needs to be made if we want to see a more stable and less violent world.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Please join me.